So Yana Valachovic, she is the forest advisor and Humboldt and Del Norte County director for the University of California Cooperative Extension. And I did send out in the agenda her resume and her biography, and it's very extensive. We're very lucky to have Yana. Yana was a co-author of a report for the Paradise Fire, and it's considered the NAP report, and it looks at the association of structure, proximity, and vegetation. So I'm just going to let Yana get started, and we are recording this meeting. We will post it on our website. We ask that you hold questions towards the end. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And Yana's requested if you could just in your question, talk about your association, if you're fire, if you're a utility, if you're a WUI resident, just so she knows who she's answering questions to. All right, and if everybody can mute themselves, please, we'll start. Thank you so much, Yana.
You're welcome. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I appreciate the invitation. Always a little strange in the Zoom world now, where you can, pop into someone's already established group and hope that you can reach the audience when you don't really know who's in the room. So I'll do my best to sort of talk at different scales. I have a talk set up today, which has sort of a couple of parts. I am open to thinking about what we do with this time here. So I was invited specifically to talk about the work that we did in Paradise, looking at home survival and the effect of Chapter 7A. But I will share that I recently came back from the Marshall Fire, and I've got some information from the Marshall Fire, a lot of pretty pictures. So I have about 40-ish slides total, and happy to use my time however it's best for you all. I know that this paper has created a lot of conversation, which is exciting for us. As a scientist and a practitioner and a manager and someone who works in policy, I'll say that it's this is the best. This is really the best. This is when you feel like you've actually made an impact and you've created information that people can use. So just for context in my background, I'm really trained as a registered professional forester and a research scientist. I do cover lots of different disciplines, and I'm a lifelong learner. I did live in Oakland during the Oakland Hills Fire, so I have some fresh impression of how we've evolved in 30 years in our thinking about home loss. And to me, this is one of the most pivotal issues that we face. We spend a lot of time really demanding a lot about what the wildland can do, but we've sort of forgotten about the equation about what the built environment needs to be able to be prepared for. So, that's in part why I'm sort of shifting some of my research interests to be in this space, because I think we need to really talk about the design and intersection between the built environment and the wildland environment, because the wildland can't do it on its own. So if that sounds like a good start to you all, and for those that are moderating this, please feel free to bump in and tell me if I'm off base in any way. What I've got set up is basically a little background on the campfire, which I think most of you have probably heard a bit about. I'm going to just do a little review on kind of what are the key factors that contribute to home loss. I've been told there's a number of fire marshals in this room and other folks that do some of this work. So, catch me if I use words that you don't think are appropriate or whatever. I'm going to talk about our study, design, key findings, and then I have, as I said, about 10 slides from the Marshall Fire, which I think really give you an interesting comparison and contrast to what we were learning from Paradise. And then I've got a couple of wrap-up take-home messages. So happy to answer questions in a time period that makes sense to you all, and talk on many levels here. So, just for review, the campfire, was in November. There were, in the end, over 18,000 structures were destroyed. Wasn't very big by acres. And part that from a scientific perspective that's particularly interesting is that Paradise burned really in less than 12 hours. So you have as compared to other fires, kind of a more consistent and uniform burning period, which means you have less variability and less other factors to adjust. The Marshall fire is also similar to that. It's not a fire that had different flavors on different days, for example. A large portion of the homes were in Paradise. And as you all may have heard, this is east on the left-hand side of the screen. The fire ignited at around 6 a.m. From a power line wind interaction issue. Here's at about 10:45, and you can see that the town of Paradise had ignitions all the way throughout the entire town, even in that short time period. There's lots of stuff to talk about in evacuation and preparedness and alerts and all that stuff, but I'm going to focus just really on the home loss issue. It was a red flag warning day. There were winds to be predicted in the 25 to 35 mile an hour range. We certainly saw gusts 50 miles an hour and a little bit greater. And it was after a long dry period, which, here we are today sitting in what feels like that again. So, given that background, here's what I'm gonna do a little, kind of teaching, how our team thinks about home loss is really around three main themes. The direct flame contact, so you have an ignition from somewhere in the wildland or someone away from the home, and flames are driven directly to the home, and you have direct flame contact. There's also embers, which we're becoming much more familiar with, which are wind distributed, and they can be either from the wildland or they can also be from other buildings, and so construction related. Other term you hear is firebrands, and those are moved in the air column. And those, if they are significant size, can land on receptive fuels, like in the gutters here, vegetation close to the buildings, on the decks. They can also penetrate the vents. And so you have something that can basically pass over our typical defensive space actions. And then thirdly, we have something called radiant heat, where you get direct heat transfer, but not flame contact, which can lead to a weakness or failure point in the building. I'm illustrating this with windows. And I think as a society, we spent most of the time talking to the public about this direct flame contact piece, and we're really beginning to now be aware about this ember component. But the radiant heat piece is something that has been not as commonly shared. And so, thinking about the population of people that we all serve and where they're at is, one of the challenges that I think we all face right now. And so you're going to see changes in defensible space code as a result of this ember piece and a number of other issues, related through updates in Chapter 7A and other components. So given that frame, how do we digest what we saw in Paradise? And, I think we all now understand how insidious embers can be and how they can find our little, small vulnerabilities and, find nooks and crannies and, penetrate our buildings. And, they can do things like this where, the Angora fire a long time ago now, it appears as if like, a gamma ray from a spaceship came down and blasted this house. It wasn't a vegetation carried fire that led to the loss of this home. So we assume when we see things like this, that it's a result of an ember either finding a way into the building or creating ignition on or near the building that led to the loss in this situation. So, when we think about buildings, we also recognize that there are a number of vulnerable locations. So roof to wall intersections where we ask the wall to behave as well as the roof does, as shown in the dormer on the left, and the collection of litter and
ember blows and it flows across the roof and it gets up against the wall.
And then there's the rain gutters, which are critical for the robust performance in the siding, so you don't get rotten durability problems. We also know about fences and how fences can bring fire to the buildings. And here's on the bottom two panes are taken from inside a building. So the camera is looking at either the gable end vent or the under eave vent, and the embers are able to basically get inside the building. They're of big enough size. And the mesh is of a wide enough coarse screen that the embers can penetrate. And if they find something that's receptive and they have enough heat within them, they can create ignition. So trying to reframe how we think about building performance given these vulnerabilities is a lot of what I do in my educational program. So given that as a background, our team, which was a really great group of folks to work with, had 3 research questions. And we were curious, did the proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? So is there a community or neighborhood effect? Additionally, did the fuels associated with the nearby vegetation also factor into the probability of survival? And then, specifically, we were curious if the full adoption of Chapter 7A, which is the California Building Code associated with WUI, increased and improved odds of home survival. So we set out to answer those questions to the best of our abilities. And we made some specific decisions in the beginning, and those were to focus in on the town of Paradise itself. So this is different from the NIST data and other data sets. We also focused specifically on the single family homes. And the map on the right is really like one of the first things where it was like, oh my gosh, we actually have something we could work with, because you can see the age of single family homes is coded by color. So red being after the adoption of 2008, green being the decade on the other side of the adoption, so before the adoption, and then older homes in gray. Now, what you see is that they're well distributed across the town. It's not like half the town was developed in one time period and half the town was developed in another time period. We actually had a lot of infill construction, and we had, just a nice sampling so that, if you had a canyon effect, it wasn't going to just be hitting one type of home. So we then intersected the DINS data to the parcel layer, and we coded homes into destroyed, damaged, where you might see a window cracked or melted gutters or something to that effect, or no impact at all. So we started with a population of about 8,000 homes. And then what we did is, you can't look at 8,000 homes with enough detail without killing yourself. We subsampled down to 400 homes, and we did those based on the fact that there were 142 homes that were built after the new construction code was adopted. So that gave us basically the driver. So we sampled 100 homes of the 142 after the new construction code was adopted. We sampled 100 on the previous decade. And then to balance out the statistics, we randomly sampled 200 homes in this population of older homes. So remember, what's driving a lot of our study is really looking at the effect of the construction codes themselves. So now what we did, and you have to remember that at this point, there isn't a pre-data set that tells you the starting condition of every home. All you have is the era of construction and some assumptions that might come with that. So, it's not a perfect study where you know everything about the home before it's exposed and then what happens afterwards. So we're limited, and there's, I want to, start with a caveat. We're limited on what data that we can get access to. So we looked at overstory cover, visually estimated within a 30-meter. So this is the building itself, within a 30-meter band around a home, and within a 100-meter radius around the home. We also measured, this is using Google Earth images, basically the distance to the nearest destroyed structure specifically. So that could be a home, a business, a garage, an outbuilding, looking in pre and post. We can't get at understory cover, so we don't know what the surface fuel conditions are. So, that's a challenge that we just have to accept. We also looked at lot size in the assessor's database, and then we also looked at land use codes. So looking at the interface where you've got greater than 6 houses per kilometer within 50% wildland vegetation, or versus the intermix. So we're curious, like, do we see an effect basically of land use? And then we also looked at slope as another variable. So would I like more variables? Sure, but at least we had consistent variables for every one of our sample population types. So I don't expect you all to nerd out with me in statistics, and I know there's some in your group that really like to do that. What I want to say is there's a lot of data, there's a lot of things to talk about. I'm going to get to the main messages, but what's interesting is Lot size is kind of an interesting variable because lot size is just really an area measurement, square foot area measurement. And a lot of lots can be long and skinny. They also, where the home is on the lot may not imply that there are big setbacks. It's not a great proxy for what the actual conditions are. What we did see is that the older homes were on smaller lots, and they had a higher density, a higher proportion of homes around them, and they generally had more canopy cover. And that makes some sense in that they have more canopy cover because they were built in an older time period, and the vegetation has been allowed to grow for a longer time period. Harder to take trees down or manage the vegetation as it gets older. So there's something to think about in that respect. New construction is a little bit is on bigger lots, and the lot size here may not be fully comparable to your communities. These are really more dispersed, widely dispersed lot sizes, and they're overall bigger. So what we did, and this is called an analysis of variance, where you generally look to see what the outcome is, in this case survival, and what it's statistically related to. And what I really want to point out, two things were not related. So land use was not a driver in any of our variables, nor was the canopy cover in the first 30 meters. It's a little hard to interpret the canopy cover piece, but I'll talk more about that as we move on. We definitely see a strong statistical relationship to the time period of construction, the distance to the nearest destroyed structure, the total number of destroyed structures within 100 meters, the canopy cover a little farther away from the buildings, and then some interaction effects of distance to nearest structure and time, and canopy cover and time. So I'm gonna dig in and try and help you understand what this all means. So one of the statistical tools we have is something called a decision tree analysis, where you plug all the data in and you let the computer figure out where the thresholds are in relationship. And basically you let the computer sort through all the different variables and come up with the sort of the best fit of survival probability. And so what's interesting, so we asked the question, did proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? And so what surprised us was the first split in the model is basically the distance to nearest destroyed. Now, we're not determining what that threshold cutoff is. The computer is essentially doing the computational analysis to figure out that question. And so what we see is basically where you're greater than 18 meters, which is 54 feet. If you are if you are greater than 18 meters, then your probability of survival decreases. If you're so 73% of homes were less than 18 meters away from a destroyed structure. So basically survival is highly being influenced by the neighbor effect. So then our second question got answered immediately in this model as well. And that is, did the fuel associated with the nearby vegetation factor into the probability of survival? So if the homes were greater than 18 meters away, if they were more than 50 feet separated, and there was less than 50% canopy cover, the probability of survival increases to 48%. So we see basically a strong relationship to the presence of how the nearby structure, how it performs, and then the available fuels that are coming from the canopy as the second most important variable in the model. Now, we see an age effect, and then we also see a minor slope effect. So 73% probability of survival increases when homes are greater than 18 meters away, have less than 53% canopy cover, are built after 1973, and are on moderate slopes. And in Paradise, only 7.5% of homes met this condition. So what do we do with that data? How do we think about it? What does it mean? We also took a small subsample of about 300 homes that were in the DINS data that had pictures of the condition, and we evaluated each of those visually based on what we thought was the fire damage. So damaged homes are useful because they're frozen in time and you at least have a sense of what the exposure might have been, you know, as opposed to lost homes where, you know, it's just a pile of rubble of ash and you really don't know what sequences happened. So when we went through those 300 available homes, we concluded that 63% of the damaged homes were from radiant heat. And then we also, you know, had some other categories like direct ember ignition or flame to indirect ember ignition, some continuity with fuels and such. When we saw damage from radiant heat, they were largely associated with damage to windows and exterior walls. And I think, you know, using this image, I think it really makes sense. So there's a bunch of green trees. So these are the ponderosa pine trees. There's a bunch of brown trees that are damaged. Paradise is a community that is, you know, on a plateau with a bunch of conifer trees and a whole bunch of hardwoods, California black oak specifically. And, you know, what you don't see is a crown fire that burned all the trees. What you see is really the effect of these buildings themselves having, you know, a lot of heat output once you create ignition that is damaging the surrounding vegetation. So you can anticipate that there is a lot of heat effect that happens between buildings, and where they happen to be close to each other, there's a lot of exposure. And so it's conceivable that once you get exposure, you can have a strong community effect here. So our interpretation of the pathways is that the majority were embers to some type of ignition on the building themselves, which then led to a radiant heat exposure issue to the next and surrounding buildings. So this community effect is pretty pronounced. Here's a couple other images from Paradise where you can see, you know, here's, you know, a whole neighborhood. They're rather tight to each other, and there was a lot of heat pressure and radiant heat pressure on these surrounding buildings, where if you keep the integrity of the neighborhood, as shown in yellow here, then the outcome is a little bit different. So the spatial arrangement definitely has an effect here. So the third question we had was the full adoption of the 2008 Chapter 7A code associated with improved odds of survival? And so let's look at this graph here. And so survival is in percentage on the y-axis. The x-axis is basically the time period of construction by decade, and you can see that, you know, what the composition of the eras of homes were. Majority were built after 1950, and you know, survival basically increases with time. So 11% survival on homes built before 1997. 39% associated survival on homes built after 1997. You know, the trend is great. A much more significant, you know, improvement, but there isn't a statistically significant improvement between, you know, where this line is in 2008 when we started to see adoption of the new code, and to some degree that's exactly what I would expect, because, you know, a roof service life, and we know the roof is one of the primary drivers in building performance and fire exposure. You know, back to 2 decades, a roof should still be in its period of performance that's 2 decades old. We see a significant change to the usage of dual pane windows, as you know, in newer construction. So there are a number of things independent of Chapter 7A that are putting newer constructed buildings in better condition. There's also just the effect of time, in that the maintenance effect. You know, a building should be in pretty good shape for 20 years before you start to really have to do a bunch of maintenance. So, you know, it's not a total surprise to us. So conclusions and caveats associated with this. Let's talk about the vegetation issue first. So, you know, higher survival is associated with a lower overstory tree cover. And, you know, that also makes some reasonable sense. This fire ignited in, what was it? It was November 3rd, right? So it's right in the period of leaf drop. This picture on the right was actually taken November 3rd, this year, so 3 years after the campfire. And you can see the contribution of black oak litter on the building itself and on the ground. So even, and this is a situation where a lot of trees have been removed around this home here. So, you know, figuring out how to have the amenity values of the shade and the cover, but then handle the contributions of fine materials, I think is our challenge. And how do we design our buildings and develop the maintenance structures to be able to handle that? You know, we think that the influence of trees is really indirect, you know, because it drops these items themselves. It's not the trees themselves that are causing the problems. Importantly, we didn't see homes that showed evidence of continuity to wildland fuels. So we didn't see the homes themselves burning into the community or into the landscape. And then I think another really important factor here is that, you know, defensible space is a concept that is evolving in California, and our codes and our implementation have been, I'm going to just be straight up, inconsistent, and they're changing with new state policy, but they haven't paid as much attention to the combustibles near to the home, which are particularly important when it comes to ember ignitions. And so, you know, our cultural practice in California is to anchor our buildings with a lot of foundation plantings, a lot of landscaping that makes the home feel both beautiful and grounded. And that is a fundamental vulnerability in how homes perform when it comes to exposure with embers. So Chapter 7A was adopted, but there were still immense amounts of fuel around homes in how we landscape our structure. So in other words, I don't think that Paradise was a perfect, Paradise doesn't represent all of what we think is right when it comes to construction and assembly and D-space and all those important interacting elements. So, you know, also within this, we didn't have pre-fire surface fuel vegetation data. So, you know, we're making some assumptions about what we think is happening, and we are missing that variable, even though there's just no data set to drive that. Now, the other part is about, you know, sort of the neighborhood effect. And, you know, once you get ignition in the neighboring buildings, you know, then the type of fire you're managing is a different animal. And I think we all understand that from urban fires. But the challenge is when you have, you know, crew availability drawdown and folks focused on, you know, evacuation as the primary effort in the first phase of the event. So, you know, once a neighboring building is lost, then it definitely puts a lot of radiant heat pressure on the surrounding homes. And so how we think about Chapter 7A, and I'm not on the Chapter 7A committee, so I can't answer where and how the changes are coming. I know that we're in an update process right now. And, you know, Chapter 7A is really a baseline, and it's going to continue to modify. And we think, you know, looking at the 2008 iteration, there's a lot of room for improvement in Chapter 7A respective to radiant heat. So, you know, this data is being used to feed back into some of that thinking here. You know, I talked a little bit earlier about construction standards and materials are making a difference, you know, with the long service life and double pane windows, but, you know, maintenance is really important in this. And, you know, I think that for me, I mean, I both work in policy, which can start regulation, and I also work in education. And I think where my head is these days is really trying to be clear to communities and neighbors about what their vulnerabilities are and how they can work together to manage those potential radiant heat exposures. Because, you know, we have lots of California developed that's already got much closer contact between buildings, and they should understand how to sort of mitigate and do some code plus work to be able to manage some potential radiant heat exposures. Now, this study was really in a lower density, you know, I don't even want to call it suburban community. And I do believe that once, you know, so it's not comparable to all settings, but once homes do engage, then I think building density becomes an additional challenge. The 18 meters or 54-foot threshold in separation is similar to some other other findings from other studies, but I'm not going to say that that is the number that we should be working on. There's some good new research that's going to be trying to address this ignition issue at different densities. And so, I've mostly been talking about a 30-foot, 25 to 30-foot separation, but we could talk some more about that if you're interested in it. So with that, I don't know if I bored you, if it would make sense to answer some questions, or if I should take about 5 more minutes and talk about what we saw in the Marshall Fire.
Well, we have a couple of questions, so we could start. I mean, the Paradise Fire is a little bit different than the Marshall Fire, so maybe we could just ask some questions. So I did see MJ had a question. I'm sure you can read it right here.
Yeah, so there were 2 questions. So were mobile homes and manufactured homes excluded from the subsample? And the answer is yes. We really just focused in on single family construction. There's a lot of issues, I think, with manufactured homes, and in particular, their density is something that, they're often 5 to 6 feet apart. They're really tightly placed, and because they don't have solid foundations, they're vulnerable in lots of places. There's a lot of mobile manufactured homes, mobile in particular, in Paradise. And then the second question was, any idea what percentage of homes had wood shake roofs? And I can't know that because we don't know what the starting conditions are of the homes. I can assume that very few likely had that in the newer construction periods, just because we seem to have, by preference, moved away from that. But we just don't know what those starting conditions were. Certainly, wood shake home, it's hard to meet the Class A standard, so which is required in Chapter 7A.
Yana, in any of the damaged homes, did you see Vulcan, the Brand Guard, or O'Hagan vents? Do you think those vents?
We are limited to what the DINS inspectors took pictures of, right? So we weren't driving that inspection process. So I don't think we can answer that question with any reliability. I will say that in my on-the-ground review of surviving homes, I've seen more Vulcan vents there. And, I think it's really a little bit dependent on the manufacturers and the supply businesses and sort of who they're working with. I think Vulcan has a pretty good relationship to that part of the world. I'm quite fond of Brand Guard from some little dorky studies I did, but I don't know. So there's 2 questions here. Did the burning structures themselves, did you say the burning structures themselves did not contribute to the landscape burning? Correct. That's correct. For new construction, does this support structure spacing of 30 feet or more? Well, that's the question that everybody wants the answer to. And let me get back to that at the end. I think this is contributing evidence, but I think there's more room to go in how we think about this and how we think about compliance within 7A and assemblies and different types of performance. In 7A, what I understand, you either comply or you don't. In some of the other systems, like the international code, there are some classes and ways to comply. So there's more to that subject. So I'm going to hold off on putting a definitive number, though. From an educational perspective, when we talk about existing construction, Steve Quarles and I use the term somewhere between 25 and 30 feet, your radiant heat exposure potential goes up significantly. And that means for all structures, not just other people's homes. It can be the garden sheds, it can be the junior barn that gets added later, it can be a wood shed, it can be a number of other types of structures that people might put on their property, and especially when they're in closer proximity to windows and under eave areas, you get some additional issues. Let me talk about Boulder, because I think this will help inform our conversation. So Boulder, the Marshall Fire kicked off on December 30th, little 5 weeks ago. It's on the, for those of you who don't know where Boulder is, it's on the east side of the Rockies, and it's basically in that transition point from the Rockies to the plains. And here's an image of the types of communities that were being exposed. And here's the smoke column as it's being blown. There were horrific winds that day. And it's still not clear what the ignition point may have been. At this point, I don't think we're talking about power lines. So for those of you who do these damage inspection studies, you know that there's a limited capacity to get, what you can get is difficult. What we tried to do was look at the transition between damaged and destroyed buildings. We did this January 12th through 15th. I was working with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and then also with Wildfire Partners. That's Dr. Steve Quarles, if you know him. And we were after sort of a couple questions to look at pathways for fire spread from wildland to homes. As you know, grass, you can get embers off of grass, but there's not a lot of longevity in those embers. So it's rare to get a long distance ember cast from a grassland that will create ignition. And then we were really trying to look at some of the typical between home distances and where we could see home to home spread. And what was great is that Wildfire Partners helped us meet a lot of the community members. So we got some of the anecdotal stories, and we got some more information about time and what happened and what the mechanisms were. So here is a map of the fire. You can see destroyed in red, you can see damaged in yellow, and my arrows are basically locations where we went. So we were after these transition points, and where you've got damage to destroyed, and see if we could figure out what might have been happening there. Was it an effect of suppression? Was it an effect of change of construction type? Was it because of a community member? What happened? And again, just to look at the landscape right here are the foothills of the Rockies, and we are in this transition point. So we're not in the forest conditions, we're really in grasslands. There are some trees that are in some of the ravines and other lower depressions, but it's a very different vegetation type. That's Daniel Gorman, if you know Daniel. And what we saw was really, what we heard about were basically these wind gusts that were over 100 miles an hour. It wasn't that big of a fire. The fire was basically put out by heavy snowfall that happened the next day, and then a significant relaxation in the winds, which made defensible actions possible. We lost a little over 1,000 structures, including a new hotel, a Target, a shopping center. So it's got some reminiscent qualities to the Tubbs fire and the Kmart, and it damaged 149 structures. So I'm just going to show you a couple of case studies. This is an example of new construction. This is 2021. This is kind of a condo style development, and these are individual condos themselves. There's a pathway here. It's downsloping. The wind is coming from the direction of these arrows. And so until we got there, we didn't really know what was happening. And what we learned is that the fire got here a little later in the evening. And basically the reason these homes were survived is because the fire suppression team basically decided to make this the line in the sand given this existing pathway. And basically the winds died down at 8 o'clock at night. So they couldn't hold the line at these houses, but this is where they made the line. What you see looking at the surviving homes is really the effect of annealed versus tempered glass. And I thought I'd bring it forward just to kind of show the strong contrast. So tempered glass required in sliding glass doors, but not required in these kind of daylight windows up above. So we had full failure both panes in the annealed glass, even though they were double pane glass. In this situation, we had a lot of radiant heat hitting these surrounding buildings. I didn't see any, they were only single pane tempered glass. I didn't see a single pane, I didn't see a single tempered glass pane break. But, clearly it would have been very easy to lose these buildings once you've got those access into the house by these broken windows, both panes. So you'll see us talk a lot about tempered glass and the importance of tempered glass and the stronger resistant quality of tempered glass. I mean, here's a really great example of that. It's like 3 times greater. And so where you've got greater density, I mean, from an educational perspective, I'd say dual pane tempered, both panes tempered. Yeah, that makes some sense, especially where you've got adjacent on the sides where you've got adjacency. Here's another illustration of kind of the typical residential neighborhoods. These are late 80s construction. You can see a little pocket of destroyed homes, but then you've got surviving homes around them. So we dug into this location, and what we learned was that there was firefighter response here. And so that's what basically prevented continued expansion and greater ignition to the surrounding buildings. We saw a lot of radiant heat damage on this surviving building, but there was structure response. And what we learned from the community was that basically these were losses that started as fence to home. So we had embers igniting grass, then igniting material often caught at the base of a wooden fence. Wooden fences connected directly to homes. And that will be a theme that I'm going to talk a lot about. Here's, wildland, which is, more rangeland, grass communities. And, this is a complete lost neighborhood. It's one of the first communities to get exposed. But just you can see, even in this sort of thin soiled, not heavily vegetated environment, this fence effect. And we don't know really what contributed to the loss of these homes themselves, but we can at least illustrate some of this fence effect that we saw throughout our whole time. Here's another example where both fences had firefighter response. So we had, in this case, a retaining wall. We had and there's a big highway right up above this retaining wall, and this section here, we had embers to mulch, mulch to fence, and then fence was coming down to the homes. Similar as you can see here, but fortunately, because we had response, we were able to break that pathway. This story is really fascinating, and we probably spent the most time at this location. The wind is coming from the left at that high intensity. There's a golf course here on the right. This community built in the late 80s. Significant use of stucco as the main form of construction type, and they made walls as part of their fences. The walls basically are wood structures, so you can see the wood posts sticking out at the bottom. They're wrapped in a stucco product, and so they have a lot of. You could have like sort of almost like a retaining wall, a deflector wall kind of thought around them. But at the base of the walls is exposed to their combustible structures. So what we think happened in this particular situation, and because this is a damaged building, we can see things sort of frozen in time, is embers blew over into the golf course and then burned, a backing fire burned to the base of this stucco wall with the wood embers, with the wood construction. There was material caught, there's a little fence at the bottom here. This was a wooden fence. There were woody mulch was kind of around in this whole area. So we had embers to grass, grass to fine fuels, to mulch, to this fence. And then we basically, this is the property separation line. Basically, we had the fire wick along that fence, and then it made a hard turn and attached directly to the house. While the house is primarily non-combustible in the exterior cladding, the under eave area and the fascia itself were wood, and we believe the pathway to entry was basically via that fence and enough flames and heat to penetrate and get inside the attic here. So you can see it, this is the other way, the flip around. This home survived, but there was firefighter response, and you can see signs of the fence here. So I'm bringing this forward because these small details really matter. Here's an example. They use a lot of rock mulch, and this would be in what we would call zone 0, or the first 5 feet. This is probably 2 feet itself, rock mulch. And there are in this home's case, 2 examples of woody vegetation. This is a decorative conifer. I don't know the name of it, but I've seen it. Holds on a lot of fine litter. And then this is often quite supple, but it's pretty woody in this condition, been after a long drought. So we had embers come down this this road and basically get lodged in the canopy of the tree, which is not so common. Normally you have a surface fire, which then creates enough heat to get the tree itself involved. But in both cases, we then had ignition, which put force and pressure on the vents. And we had penetration in this direction, and we also had under eave penetration. So I bring these forward because these small details really do matter. And then I know I'm spending a lot of time on this one particular home. While we have stucco construction, I want to just illustrate this fiber-based composite fascia and eave. And you can see that where we pulled it apart. And then this is the assembly of the stucco. So if I were to stick a camera basically right at this transition between the foundation itself, the perimeter foundation, and looked upward is how the wall overlaps the foundation, what I would see is exposed, basically fiber-based sheathing that sits right underneath with no protection on it whatsoever. So super easy to get accumulated material right adjacent to the edge of the stucco, and then you can get ignition, and then you have ignition basically put pressure on that fiber-based exterior sheathing and bypass the stucco. So all these little assembly details matter. And I've just got one last image here to leave you with. This home did survive. It was in a neighborhood that it was the last home to be built. The majority of them were built probably in the 80s, a few in the 70s. Every other building was lost except for this one. This one was built, I think, in 2019, something to that effect. They did really everything right, and it's just so fun when you find these examples. So lots of really interesting usage of walls and separations and non-combustible rock to create their defined garden beds and still create beauty. Very well constructed stucco, an unvented attic, just a lot of really fine details. We are in debate. We don't know the answer whether there was fire suppression on this. Talking to the community, it seems unlikely, but we don't 100% know. But when you flip around and you look at the other side of this building, there's kind of a cove entryway where it's the front door is set back, and there's sort of two sections of the home that wrap around it, probably protects them from the wind. But this house almost lost it. And the reason it almost lost it is because we had embers burning their little bear. We ended up with ignition and pressure right on the front door. And then this is the front, just to the left of this section here. There was a garden bed with woody vegetation and woody mulch, and we had full ignition of that and ignition of the lawn furniture. It was close. So, how we communicate, more than code, but practice as well, I think is some of the challenge. So, bringing home the take-home points about what we saw at Marshall. Really, fences were really an important factor, allowing fire to burn to the homes. Combustible materials in the first 5 feet were observed in locations where that led to direct flame contact. And then the details really matter, both in the material type and the assembly. So, how we, not all stucco is equal. And generally where we saw damaged homes were where we had firefighter or other first responder or community response. So I think this very much applies to all of our situations here, and how we change our educational messages. These materials from CAL FIRE are still in circulation. We'll see these change, but how we reframe and think about what ignition resistance looks like is gonna morph. And we need to talk about plants, and the placement really is the driver, not the plant type so much. And in conclusion, I'll just say that we're trying to do a better job at our shop to talk about vulnerabilities in the home hardening element, especially associated with steeper slopes, and especially associated where you've got denser neighborhoods, and the specific elements of the building that become more vulnerable in those locations. such as the windows and the siding. So I will conclude by saying I'm really optimistic. I think we're getting a lot of good information in that can give us reason for hope in this space. I think there's a lot that can be done. And, I just want to appreciate how hard you all are working in this space, and, look forward to kind of the next decade as we get more unified messaging and alignment on our programs. And we figure out means for incentives to upgrade existing homes, both for embers and radiant heat. And we start to show the public that, beauty is possible, and that they can have the qualities of the sanctity of their home. It might look a little bit differently, but I think we just have to adjust our eyes to be able to think about living in a fire adapted community. So with that, I'll stop. I probably exceeded my time, and look forward to some help moderating the questions. So.
Oh yeah, thanks, Yana. This is great. I mean, your detail, I think you hit it. I mean, it's all about the details. You can have this amazing ignition resistant structure and then put an unregulated shed that is not subject to Chapter A. And in our county, anything, I think that's 120 square feet or less, you can build without a permit. And so it's not subject to Chapter 7A. And if you put it, 5 feet next to your house, or maybe maybe you use your house as the back wall, which we see a lot of, that's your vulnerability. And that, I think what you're prefacing is the detail that you cannot miss. Because we all know how, much money and time and energy we're putting in trying to make our houses ignition resistant. So did you see a lot of sheds and unregulated buildings that were not 7A, or just, maybe utility buildings that you think ended up either damaging or, being the ignition that then burned down the main structure?
Yeah. I think that the point is, what are our points of contact with communities, right? They're at the building construction permit phase, the completion, maybe in a remodel, and then depending on whether you're LRA or SRA, with some frequency associated with a D-space inspection. Lots of things happen between those points of time, and I think we've got a lot of room for growth in how we message the vulnerability of adding that shed. I mean, think about how many tiny homes got built during this time period. How many people got a junior barn because they needed an office space during COVID that they didn't have. I mean, we all face different pressures and choices, and those are highly unregulated. I don't propose that they need to be regulated. I just propose that people need to understand what the vulnerabilities are and think about them so that we can make distinctions in choice and mitigate the effect that we accidentally invoke by whatever the action was.
Okay, great. We have a question from Bob Turkett. He lives in a WUI community in Portola Valley and is a wildfire resiliency advocate. So go ahead, Bob. Your question.
Thank you. Two questions. One, a quick one. In the slides you showed of the Marshall Fire, where you introduced the concept of fences being sort of routes to fire reaching home. You mentioned that the home in the background showed radiant heat damage. And I was wondering if you knew offhand what the separation distance was in that case.
I'm gonna spitball that and say 25 feet.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is about your paper, which is excellent, and I congratulate you on it. It's been the source of a very lively conversation in our community. Some of us are arguing that home hardening, vegetation management, and basic CAL FIRE regulations and NFP standards like structure separation are critical. Others are arguing that vegetation management and home hardening are sufficient, and they actually point to your paper as evidence that distance doesn't matter, which is kind of remarkable in my opinion. But the crux of the argument is that the statistic that you show in your table, distance to any nearest structure destroyed or not, is not significantly different for homes that were destroyed versus those that survived. That's what they're basing the argument on. I think there's a number of flaws, a number of fallacies with that argument, but the biggest one is that, as I understand it, that number in your table is a weighted average so that the 92% of the homes in Paradise that were built before 1997 dominate that effect. And so I was wondering if you would comment on that, and more generally about to the extent to which your findings support the idea that minimum separation standards as advocated by CAL FIRE and NFPA make sense. Thanks a lot.
Well, that's a good meaty question. Thanks, Bob. I think these are points that these are data points, and I think we need to keep working in this space. We're all subject to mandates to increase housing stock availability in California for good reason. So there are trade-offs in this argument, and I don't think we're ready to put the number out there. And I think the point is that everyone has room for improvement, existing construction, new construction, and we have to figure out how we elevate this together.
I guess what I'm asking is, do you see the data in your paper as supporting the idea that we could back off from the NFPA standards? You can pass. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think I need to think about that a little bit longer.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, Yana, we have a question from Rusty Day. Rusty Day is on our advisory board. His question is, what is the difference, if you can explain the difference between non-combustible siding materials and non-combustible assemblies,
Right.
and why they matter?
Right. So there's ignition resistant materials themselves, but sometimes their performance is dependent upon an assembly. So the let's give you an example. So composition shingles can be a standalone. And correct me if I'm wrong, there's some fire marshal folks here, but roll roofing is often dependent on the assembly itself. And so how one product gets evaluated is dependent often on the assembly itself. So looking at that example of the stucco siding, you saw an ignition resistant material, but you saw that the assembly was essentially vulnerable because of that fiber-based sheathing that was exposed. So whether contractors understand that, whether building inspectors understand that, I don't work in that world, but that's the basic premise. So thinking about how parts need to work together versus whether they can stand alone on their own is the important consideration here.
So, Yana, I'm going to put you on the spot. So if you were not a forester and you were a building official, and you were a building official in a WUI community, what changes would you make to your building code for materials and methods of construction in your community?
And what is the starting condition?
Say it's just the model code. Say it's not 7A, or even if it is 7A, would you make changes? And I know you've already said that there's room for improvement, and I think everybody on this call agrees that 7A is great, but there's room for improvement. So let's say 7A is the standard. What would you change about 7A?
Well, there's a reason there's multiple authors on this paper, because we all bring different things to the equation. So I'm going to be, very clear in that I'm not on the 7A committee, and I don't know exactly where the changes are going. I think the key concept here is that we have to be prepared for embers, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. And when you look at our building code, they have to be able to address all three of those exposures, and they have to be able to pivot in the situational context in which the building is being developed. So where you've got density, then radiant heat becomes greater. Where you've got, an intention of an outbuilding that is maybe not available yet, but will be available, then we need to be talking about that so that the best choices can be made at the time. Dawn, I see you looking at me with that. It's so hard not to do this with a crowd to know whether you're in the audience or not. But
well, what we found is what counties and building and planning departments wants to do is they kind of want to have a one size fits all. And I found as a fire marshal that did not work. And you have areas where maybe you can have really high density, and you don't need as much, constriction or restriction. But when you move to the WUI, all bets are off, and it's a different animal. And I think when you have ignition resistant construction, like you have stucco, you have no openings, you can be a little closer to an adjacent structure. But if you have a wall and it has openings, it's vulnerable. Tempered windows and all, it's still vulnerable. And so I think you have to have more ignition resistant details in your plan. You have to either have more separation or things that are, non-combustible. And
Maybe you don't put the window in the garage that, is right on the property line.
exactly. So when you have that exposure, you have to realize I have an exposure. Now, this has happened to all of us. We build a house or we buy a house in a subdivision and there's no houses next to us. And then all of a sudden developer comes in and builds a whole bunch of houses within 5 feet of your structure. Your house is already built. You're not going to go around taking out windows. So this becomes really the onus of the building planning department, the city councils to say, you know what, this subdivision exists. And now we're going to, build a new subdivision, but it's creating an issue of risk to the existing subdivision that maybe is a little bit older. And that's really hard to regulate. It's very
right.
difficult.
And because the person that the risk may suddenly be exposed to is not necessarily party of the transaction. So, is there some way to, I don't know, from a policy level, is there some way to, you have a shadow effect of the new construction. What does that do to the surrounding buildings around it that are not privy to the building permit, which are suddenly now exposed in a way that they weren't before?
Yeah.
I think for me, all I can do is spend time in the educational space and make sure we're clear about what the risks are and what the communities are going to need to do. But I think we're all in this together. I think that's clearly the message to me, and everybody's got room for improvement. I spent a lot of time on my talks talking about my mom, and my mom is one of those classic, it's always somebody else's problem kind of people. And I just want to say, look at our own buildings and our own stuff, because we all have room for improvement. So, what are those options though? We can talk about deployable metal shutters. We can talk about how we're going to use AB 38 and what we might be able to create with retrofits and how we fund that. There's some efforts to try and work through this, but it's going to be messy for a while.
Okay, we have a question from Susan Miller. Susan, I don't think we've met, so if you want to just, I'll go ahead and unmute you, and if you just want to say what your affiliation is, or you can unmute yourself, I guess.
Thank you. I happen to be what's called a block captain in one of the several districts that the community has developed, volunteers right in and around Woodside and Portola Valley. So specifically what I'm very curious about is you did not really discuss the amount of brush cover on the ground, or the limbering of lower branches of trees and so on. And particularly in wooded communities like ours, it seems to me that that is a pretty high issue that should be considered. So I'm just curious as to why that didn't come up in the reviews that you've done so far.
It's a great question. Certainly we know that surface fuels contribute a huge part to fire behavior. What I was talking about in Paradise, and so this was kind of a hybrid between a science talk and an extension talk, was really what data we could get access to. So we have no idea what the starting surface fuels are like in terms of being able to do direct attack and suppression. All of that clearly matters, and under average fire conditions you want to be able to put crews out there and be able to do that. And so your flame heights are going to increase significantly with the quality and quantity of surface fuels. And if you have fire ladders, that will bring the flames into the crowns of the trees. So clearly I totally agree with you. We just didn't have data. We didn't have any way to assess that. And I guess I was trying to say that there's caveats in what we can do in these kind of post-fire events. But I think they still point to interesting questions and point to interesting information that is creating the kind of conversation that you all are having here, which is excellent. Where I'm at is that, there's no one silver bullet that's going to solve our challenges, right? We need to turn the dials, and we need to turn all of them simultaneously and together. We have to work on our alerts and evacuation systems. We have to be more thoughtful in that space. We have to figure out, yes, we figured out mutual aid pretty well. But we also get times when the system gets totally overloaded, and that's when we get in trouble. And we don't, I feel like, do a super good job in talking to community members about what to do in those moments. when there's, disparate and, limited communication because of the risk. If we tell people your best option might be to shelter in place, is not something that anyone is particularly politically comfortable with. But the reality is that people need to increase their fire literacy and need to be able to understand what's happening in the moment. And even if they don't get the alert, they need to make wise decisions about what their choices are. And sometimes that might not mean, putting themselves on a canyon road at that moment. So there's so much room for how we design our buildings, how we maintain our buildings, how we educate people about the maintenance we do, how our building contractors work in this space, how our equipment supply contractors bring the right equipment for us so that we can do the things that we need to do. I mean, we're going to be turning lots of dials for a long time. And, and what we can do now before we have to face a rebuild, that's another horrific thing to be thinking about. But what policies can we put in place today to grease that process so that it goes more efficiently for the communities that are suffering, but also creates outcomes that are going to be better from a fire performance perspective? Does a house need to go through design review again post wildfire? And the answer is no, if you build the same structure again. But the structure itself may have inherent weaknesses and vulnerabilities in its design. And wouldn't you want to encourage and incentivize people to build a better, more robust structure? Not only the materials itself, but the structure, right? We're going to stand in the way because we want design review on that. And we're going to slow it down. So, trying to get people back on their feet is, you want to get out of the way so that everybody can get there as quick as they can, given all the other difficulties they're facing. But it's that one time. So can we think about that now? I'm just going to say we're going to face a lot more wildfires, and we're in a difficult period of adjustment as we recognize the kind of fire environment that we're in. And I'm optimistic that we can get out there. I think we can get in front of it, but it's going to take some time.
I just want to put this out here. And maybe not a lot of people know about this, but a lot of times insurance companies, when you're building a fairly high-end house, the insurance companies will say, go ahead and send us your plans, and we will make recommendations that potentially can decrease the cost of your insurance, increase the, create a less vulnerability aspect for your house, not just for fire, but for flood and other things. And it's a free service that a lot of the higher end insurance companies offer. And it seems to me that each county potentially could offer a service like that with some sort of committee or an architect or contractor who's trained in ignition resistance, maybe a forester in terms of reviewing the landscape guidelines. I reviewed plans over the years that, Yana, would make your hair, curl, because they would do the screening effective vegetation. They were already in a forest, and I called it, they're building a forest within the forest. And I would, try to disallow all the screening effect. The houses would be Class A, but they would have barnwood on the exterior siding. And so, and I know that question came up from Rusty, what is a Class A assembly? And I said, folks, this is not going to work. This is not what Chapter 7A was all about. And so we were always backpedaling. And a lot of times I would reach out to either the architect or the applicant saying, what's driving your decisions here? Because I just want you to know, I feel you're making the wrong decisions and you're putting yourself and whoever's going to live in this house and your entire neighborhood at risk. So it seems to me that there should be, and maybe this is a great grant opportunity to create some sort of committee that's free of charge to contractors, to residents, that they have somebody they can go to and ask advice to review their plans, because you're right. We're trying to educate, but building a house is a very complex process. And these details that you've been explaining are so critical, down to the wood fence. People just don't think about that.
Well, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is, your planning commission does the design review, there's structures and policies in place. And especially in the wildfire rebuild environment, there's no great incentive to try and do coaching at that space in that time.
Okay, so I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So let's see, John, who is from our neighboring Fire Safe Council, and he's an amazing mapper. He has a question about air pressure, oxygen level, Colorado versus San Mateo County. We able to study or have any analytics on that? Yana?
No, I wasn't, no.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
And
yeah,
then-
not all fires, I mean, every fire has their flavor, every fire has their different unique characteristic, and every, design and construction is different. I was looking at various times and I'd be like, Steve Quarles, if you know him. I'm like, I don't get why is this? And he goes, yeah, where are you? Well, I'm in Colorado. I guess that's right. It's not California. They build differently here, right? They have a lot of daylight basements that are often single pane windows in the daylight basement. Just different styles and patterns of construction that have their own unique challenges.
Right. Well, and we did have the WUI committee from the State Fire Marshal's office. Crystal did come on our fire safe and give a presentation about things that they're planning. And we asked her, I asked her point blank, how much industry is on your committee? And she just doesn't have enough there's a lot. And so these products that are combustible keep getting allowed in the code. And that is part of the issue, but there needs to be more, advocates on the committee, like yourself, like more fire marshals. But I think you're right. I think the code will eventually get there as we learn and papers like yours are presented and talked about, and we realize how houses burn. We have a pretty good understanding now. Embers, radiant heat, vegetation. It's really fairly simple when you understand it. And you obviously have grasped it and you've documented it with pictures and words, and it's a wonderful resource. So our very last question is going to be Rusty. If you can make it a quick question, Rusty, please.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Yana. Is it possible for you to put up the slide from your Paradise presentation that showed the 3 paradigms of direct flame, ember, and radiant heat? In California, we're facing housing mandates that are going to require a great deal of new development, new subdivisions, new neighborhoods. And when we design a new neighborhood, we're going to establish the minimum lot size for each of the parcels in that neighborhood. And that's going to determine the ability to separate homes and buildings from one another. In the picture you have here, you can see it's a fairly significant lot, and you notice there are no homes around it in the picture. In your Paradise study, you found, I believe, that a separation of 18 meters, now that's 59 feet, between structures, best differentiated between the probability of survival and the probability of destruction. Now, 59 feet, CAL FIRE's minimum fire safe regulations call for 30-foot setbacks from property lines. That would be a 60-foot separation between structures on adjoining lots. That's just about what you found in Paradise. And so I'm wondering, when we design new subdivisions, when we set in stone what the possibilities are going to be for building separation, should we be following the results of your study and the results, the minimum standards set by CAL FIRE to establish what's possible to create a separation distance between structures in order to protect against radiant heat from neighboring homes and structures? How should we have to make these decisions now. We can't wait for science years from now or NIST years from now to complete its experiment. We have to make these decisions now. So the question I'm asking you to address, based on your study, based on the results that you saw in Paradise, what should we be thinking about establishing as a minimum separation between structures in order to differentiate between the probability of destruction and the probability of survival?
Great question, Rusty. Very similar to the previous one. Let me just say, I'm going to put my extension hat on here, and we have multiple competing factors that come into decision making related to when and where and how we build and what we build with and what the density looks like. And I think fire is one of them, but I think fire is not the only variable that matters in this space. Open space protection, the protection of public trust resources, needs for affordable housing, slope and constraints associated with geographic elements, road construction, road design, density of road surfaces, maintenance of all of that. I don't have the privilege of being in the place to make that decision, but I think that there are many factors that come at play here. Respective to fire, yeah, I mean, a standalone house in the middle of nowhere has the best chance of survival because it's not going to have an effect from the neighbor. You're also not going to have neighborhood kids that come over and knock on your door and play with you either. So, I mean, I grew up way out in the sticks. I know what that isolation feels like. And I'll just say that there's a lot of variables that come into play. I think we recognize that once you get ignition, then the pressure that comes from radiant heat increases. The question is, from a policy perspective, can you do better in how we design and implement and maintain our buildings so that we can prevent that ignition, so that we can manage that potential radiant heat exposure because it doesn't start from the front end. I think there's multiple strategies here, and you and I and others can probably spend some more time on it. I don't know where we sit on time here, so I'm not trying to duck out of this, but I think these are complicated issues to address, and we have to factor in all the variables that are important in this set of decisions.
Well, recognizing that there are a lot of variables, I grant you that there, and all of the variables have to be accounted for and dealt with. Recognizing all the variables, I'm asking you, based on the study that you did in Paradise, if the separation distance drops from 59 feet to say 10 feet, and we're placing structures side by side, parallel with each other, separated by 10 feet, what are we doing with this? How does that affect the probability of their destruction in a fire?
Okay, well, let's back up for a second and remember that the Paradise study is applicable to the Paradise conditions, to the slope, the vegetation types of construction, right? And if you're comparing that to another equally similar condition, then you may be able to extrapolate the findings. I think what we're saying here is that this is one data point, and this era and style of construction and this type of vegetation on these moderate slopes, because it's all construction primarily on a plateau condition, it's not steep slopes, that this is what we find. But when you aggregate out, I mean, I think we need more data points to be able to get to that answer. In this situation, in this fire, and this vegetation type, this is what we found.
And tell me, what did you find? If you were to reduce the separation distance between structures from the optimal you found, the separation of 59 feet, and I'm not saying that's optimal because obviously it's not, but if it drops down from 59 to 30, or from 30 to 20, or from 20 to 10, what's the effect of that on the probability of survival for the homes? What did you find? Tell us.
Rusty, I appreciate the question, and I think I'd rather take this offline. I'm telling you what I'm going to say, which is that it depends. This is, you can clearly read from our study what our findings are in that situation, and they're appropriate to that study.
Yeah, I think the slides are pretty, I mean, I think Yana's slides here have a lot of detail in them. And each house, each parcel, which Yana says and which I found, is a case-by-case scenario. And so it's adding all of these ignition resistant, resiliency attributes. And even then, with just one detail missed, or, with one or a few embers, or any kind of vulnerability, I think it changes the whole scale. I think we can put up on our website Yana's graphs in terms of survivability, and we could probably extrapolate information from there. What's the most important for homeowners and fire agencies to take away? So, all right, Yana. Well, thank you very much.
You are most welcome. I appreciate the good conversation. And
yeah,
so
I mean,
let me just conclude by saying I'm not afraid to build in California. I'm not afraid to build in Paradise. I think we know a lot, and with eyes wide open, we can do a lot to really manage a lot of these mitigations. So, or a lot of these risks, and we have a good sense of the toolbox to manage those mitigations. So I am optimistic.
Right. And we have a lot of new, there's a lot of new technology, there's new materials, so we're learning as we go. I guess the vulnerability really is our older communities, and I think you've highlighted that. And hopefully the state of California and maybe but federal monies will help us help those people retrofit their houses accordingly. Because I think really the older houses, and I live in one of them, it's difficult to rebuild your house. And I think that's probably part of the hardest task for people who live in California in the WUI.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, well, we appreciate you being a resource, Yana. We appreciate all your hard work and keep going to those fires and giving us information.
You're welcome. Keep doing all the good stuff you're doing. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.